Welcome back to the Lead Pursuit podcast. Tonight, we're joined by defense wargamer, author of the wargame Bandits 2, which, yes, I realize that's a crazy name for an aerial wargame, but it is the second edition of a game about bandits. David Redpath, thanks for joining us tonight.
Good evening. Thanks very much, Doug, and thanks for inviting me to Lead Pursuit.
Absolutely. So you are far more cerebral than our usual fare that we have on here. So I had to get rid of the rest of the podcast. I had to get rid of the rest of the miscreants and the troublemakers, and get rid of all that so we can have a highbrow discussion about wargaming and game design and construction. So hopefully this will be something that everyone's going to find useful for us.
I don't know how cerebral it's going to be. It's about 9:30, and I've got a BS here, so we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm on my second Jack and Coke, so I think we're probably pretty good there. So this may not be as cerebral as I'd hoped. All right, well let's jump into your background a little. So obviously you're a defense wargamer. You do a lot for a variety of services, countries, and things, and militaries. But let's talk about your wargaming background. How did you get started going down either miniatures-based wargaming, hex and counter wargaming, or any of that?
Yeah, I guess I'm definitely going to age myself here, but the very first wargame I bought was in 1973, and it was an
dating yourself,
and it was an SPI board game, and it was called Suez. Sinai, as you were, Sinai. And it had three, Arab-Israeli conflicts built into the game, the one 48, 56, and 67. And then, of course, as I bought that board game, the very first one, which I bought from the States, from the UK, and of course, this was in the days before the internet, when you had to write letters to people and this sort of stuff. And it came through the post, and as it came through the post, the Arab-Israeli war started. So I was able.
Pertinent, good timing.
It was great timing. So I was hooked, because I was able to follow the battles, on the maps. I was, introduced to my first, combat results tables and all this sort of stuff. So I guess, classic hex and counter war game. But I had, I was part of a war games club when I was a young guy, before I joined the military. And they were into every period of history, miniatures largely, not solely, but largely. Every period of history you could think of. I grew up in the northeast coast, so Jutland was quite literally due east of where I lived.
Right.
And the remnants of World War I and World War II facilities were all around me. There was a gun battery on the coast. I lived on the northeast coast. There was a big 15-inch gun battery there, which was dug into the cliff to defend the Tyne. And there was a submarine base up the road, and a seaplane base and a fighter base from World War I were quite literally 4 miles down the road in a little country village just down from my home. So I was surrounded by military history, and became very interested in that. And of course, when I joined the military, I went off to Sandhurst and trained to be an officer there. And so I was very lucky, really lucky, to have as my military history instructor at the academy, the Royal Military Academy, Paddy Griffiths, who was, a huge wargame influence in the UK, certainly. And some of the people who were at the very forefront of miniature wargaming in its inception, I guess, certainly in the UK, people like Brigadier Peter Young, who was an ex-commando, who developed a set of rules called Charge for Napoleonic War. Donald Featherston, I met on a number of occasions. So all of these people, Bill Lamming, I could go on, but they. These were the people who basically started off miniature wargaming in the UK, and then advanced it beyond, straightforward sets of rules to, war games development, and a variety of other, what I'm going to say, perhaps you said it before, more cerebral sort of wargaming. I remember Griffiths saying, figures are now causing me too much bother, so we won't have any more. So,
I,
so that,
I can
that sort of
understand that.
thing.
Well, I have one of Featherstone's books. I have his aviation wargaming, air power wargaming on the bookcase in front of me. And while it is a good read, it is so that period. And I don't know how to describe that period of wargaming where everything alternated between such precision and then such immersion. And I would laugh. I'd go, we realized we don't need some of that. I mean, yes, it's cool to hang an airplane from the ceiling and fly it across your 12-foot table of your battlefield, but that might be a step too far. I think we can just put it on.
Why would you do that? Yes, why would you do that?
I got to that page and I'm like, fascinating. I do not think I will be doing that.
That was
wargaming those days. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was weird because, I mean, there was a wargaming club at the Military Academy, and, we did campaigns and, studies of everything you can possibly think of, both professionally, but also for fun in the evenings and so on. I was at the forefront because I did computer science. I'm an infantry officer by trade, but because I also did computer science, I had a background in computer science. So when the very first computer war games came out, I had a PC miles before most people, if you see what I mean. And therefore, dived straight into every war game that was published. And as you say, some of them were terrible, and some of them were pretty good. Some of them were awful.
I just laugh how many hours I spent on tons of them. I mean, there were ones that were great, like Steel Panthers and games like that I really enjoyed. And I wish I could remember two of the strategic ones that I think were Microprose titles, but they were like a knockoff of Third Reich, but they were just as complex and took just as long to play. And having it on the computer really didn't save you any hours in the day.
No, well, some of those games. I think there was one called Flight Commander or something,
right?
And then Flight Commander 2, which was done by Avalon Hill. And it was a computer war game. It had, all the loadouts of all the aircraft, all the missions, altitude, G-lock, everything that you could possibly think of that you would put into, a game about aerial combat was represented there. And the graphics were clunky and so on and so forth. But, so I guess I've come, all the way through now to, Command on Steam and, all of the Illusion series, fighter games and stuff. But I think in my heart of hearts, I'm an infantry skirmish guy from practicality, and I'm an air power buff almost by coincidence because I did a couple of attachments to the RAF, and found it fascinating. And I guess it was the difference between what I was doing on the ground, where 3 miles an hour was like a top speed, to the straight absolute contrast of 200 nautical mile radar ranges and stuff. So I think that's probably why I got into the air side of it anyway.
Well, it's fascinating, and we've talked about that on the podcast because obviously the wide background of the rest of the podcast members, and I've even talked with other defense war gamers like Phil Bolger Cortez, who obviously works for the U.S. Air Force, but is a tanker by trade. And so he and I laugh about that. We can have very similar vocabularies. We can talk about similar actions, but yet just by virtue of the way we were raised in our own specialties, we think about things differently. I think at 480 knots, and he thinks at maybe about 25, maybe 40, and it's two different ways of approaching very similar problems, but it's funny because it's ingrained in us by the kinds of problems we've had to solve, and the way we do things.
And now I'm, after doing, fairly long stint in industry, in the defense industry, but also doing adult education as well. I got into the training side. So I started seeing the correlation between experiential learning for adults. I got a postgrad doc in that, and games and sims, and people call them sims, but they're basically games with decisions. So I branched from using wargaming quite literally to plan real operations to becoming a civilian and using games to train, everything from logistics to management techniques and so on and so forth. I was in the automotive industry for a long while and then went back into the defense industry.
It always draws you back.
Yeah, it does actually. It's almost it's a hook, and so I get a great kick now. I work for the D&D up here in Canada, and I'm part of a section in our joint wargaming center, Canadian Joint Warfighting Center, and we design, develop, and run games for Canada primarily, and occasionally we branch over into other countries as well. And
right.
And it's great to rub shoulders with people wearing green, blue, or blue again. And we are reviving wargaming up here in Canada. It was once. I mean, Canada's a pretty good track record on the commercial side. Steve Newberg and Cam Sims and Canadian Simulations and all that sort of stuff. And in fact, quite a lot of the main software wargaming companies are based up here, right, as well, in Montreal and Vancouver. So it's got a great history of wargaming in Canada, but the professional side of wargaming had basically fallen into disrepair as it had in the States. But it's been.
I was about to say we worked much better, and it's fascinating to talk to Mitch Reed and Phil and those guys and see the things they've brought back, because every service is different, and
yes,
Mitch and I have talked on podcasts about the different culture of wargaming for me in the Marine Corps versus him in the Air Force. And from day one as a Marine officer, I was raised in a culture of wargaming. We did tactical decision games. We did all kinds of training without troops, toots, or those things. We did all those kind of what we would consider war games, but of course it was way too cool. This was tactical. This was not, this was really not wargaming. But it was wargaming at its core, and that was interesting for me going through my career to see how easy it was for us to walk into an event and view it as a learning experience and say, okay, we're going to try to not shape this to our preconceived notions. We want to see, does the layout work? Does the strategy work? Does the tactics work? What are the takeaways? But you talk about the wargaming influences. I was always happy that when I went to be a forward air controller, and when we started doing our call for fire, we had one of the old school puff boards that had the little smoke puffs that would come up through the boards. You probably remember those. We had one of those, and that was my favorite little war game, was because it was considered training, and I got to sit in there and call for fire and watch little things blow up and smoke come up through the board. And people are like, "You're enjoying this way too much." I'm like, "It's a game. This is fun.
Yeah.
Why can't we all have fun and train?" Yeah. So there's a lot of military influences.
Yeah, my last posting, in actual fact, was as chief instructor at our machine gun and reconnaissance school, which was part of the support weapons wing in the UK. And of course, we had mortars, anti-tanks,
right,
and we were co-located with basically the artillery school and all the forward air observers. So we were used to having training events which sort of verged on the edge of games, but until somebody said, "Well, how much is it going to cost if we mess this up?" All right, okay, we'd have to actually.
All right, let's script it. Let's get rid of the whole gaming piece to it. Yeah. I fought that for years as an instructor at Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron. How much do we want to game versus how much do we just need to do an exercise to train people? And unfortunately, most of us instructors wanted to game. We wanted to find out how things would work, but the flight hour budget and the training budget was for people to prove they could use their actual TO weapon or their airplane. So. Well, I knew we were going to go down a rabbit hole, and to warn the podcast listeners, this may be a long episode. You may be here a while. We have a lot to talk about, and we love dropping down rabbit holes. But why did I drag you onto this podcast? So, obviously, Sebastian Bay and I have talked about a lot of things. I'm a huge fan of their Georgetown University Wargaming Society. Really enjoyed getting the socks beat off of me by their members of their society when I decided to show up and play his Littoral Regiment game there. But I saw your discussion about different types of morale in wargaming by domain. So breaking it down to land, sea, and air, and how the three innately have different morale impacts, and then if you're going to put that in a war game, which yes, you should, that's the foot stomper of the day. How do you do that? And what are the key differences? Because I think most of us are products of land wargaming and maybe a little bit of naval. But when we think morale, we think of squad leader. We think of, victory game series, the combat series, or ambush series. We think of direct morale impacts. We think of, even in the sci-fi world, like Warhammer 40K, units break, they rout, they may or may not rally, and then they become combat ineffective. But in that discussion with Sebastian, you all really painted that the three domains have different morale to start with. And so let's just talk a real quick summary of the differences between land, naval, and then air morale in y'all's view.
Yeah, the lecture that I gave, the talk that I gave with Brianna Preseviet from my shop, we both work in the same section, came about, first of all, because Sebastian, I love Sebastian, he said, I want you to do something on GUWS. You pick the subject. I went, that's
no better than that. Yeah,
that's a tough one, that one, because you can talk about anything really to do with wargaming. But the morale bit of it was part of a previous lecture which I'd given in Connections about the fact that wargaming, generally speaking, doesn't represent morale very well, and a couple of other things like surprise and fog of war and stuff. And there was a whole host of different things. That was on Connections North. But when I sat down with Brianna, we said, okay, so morale then, what's it all about? And are we building it into our games well enough to represent the real situations that we find from history sometimes aren't represented in a war game, and you'll get, units fighting to the last man, which nobody ever does unless you're Japanese, by the way. The pros and cons of having high morale at a tactical level, but then how an operational level can also, influence how good a tactical unit is before it even gets to gets on the ground. And as we were doing it, in actual fact, it's precisely what you said. I was looking at ground factors. Primarily, I was going, okay, flanking, we know flanking is, very effective. We know that indirect fire is very effective at breaking morale, and we're looking at all of the various facets of what broke morale. But as I was doing it, I was thinking, hang on, I'm from the Joint Warfare Center here. What breaks naval morale? And,
right.
I'm a huge naval fan. I actually write naval wargames rules as well for, convoy actions and stuff. But the more I started thinking about it, I thought, man, this is totally different. This is totally different. In the ground domain, morale basically is broken and achieved by a number of factors, and you can list them out. And almost any set of wargames rules, whether they're commercial or professional, will have the factors that do that. So, fatigue, training, experience, blah, blah, blah. At sea, though, if you are a sailor, and you're 99% of the sailors on a ship, you have zero choice as to where you go and what you're doing. The captain of the ship and the commodore of a task force says, we're going to do this. And the guy says, flank speed and steer course, 060, and away you go. And the vast majority of the people on a ship, all they can do is do their jobs as best they can. And then at the end of the day, they're either sunk or they've sunk the other guys, or they've disengaged or whatever it might be with damage. And you could argue that the worst morale for a naval team is when, they have to deal with damage control. Fires and this sort of stuff,
Absolutely.
I'm a veteran of the sort of Falklands era. I've actually met people from the Sheffield. I've done beer with guys from the Sheffield when they were burning, and they were saying, it was really then that you found out who had high morale or motivation and whatever, and who didn't, because the whole thing has really gone to hell in a handbasket at this point. So
I've done naval damage control school, and I never want to do that for real. No, thank you.
Yeah, and my son's in the Canadian Navy, and he's done it. And he said, it's traumatic, and so it should be, because it gets you ready for the real thing.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
I've always said that and SEER School are the two best training evolutions I've gone through, and you don't ever want to experience them. You don't want to know what goes on in them, and it prepares you to say, I'm never going to get put in that situation. So,
yeah, I've done escape and evasion interrogation. So again, I'm the same detail. Yeah, I've done it once. Like, that's cool. Sorry, I'm too old to do that now.
Exactly.
But morale for a ship and morale for a task force is completely different as well. So in the sea domain, the dawning realization as we prepared the lecture for GUWS was, it's different. And then when I started looking at air, I went, hang on, that's different again. And it's different by era as well, of course. Obviously, if you go back to, World War I, World War II, and then through to the sort of more modern era, if you like, up through Vietnam to the present day. So morale for air units and air individuals, and again, the ratio is even tighter between the people who are actually fighting. The ratio is even larger between the people who are actually doing the fighting and the rest of the organization. So, I guess it's, maybe, I don't know, 1 in 1,000 people in the Air Force actually fly something, or maybe it might be 1 in 2,000, depending on the size and shape of your Air Force. But for pilots and, WISOs or, radio RIOs, whatever you want to call them, 2-man or larger crews in World War II in bombers, B-17s and Lancasters and stuff like this, morale was completely different. And Absolutely. Multiple missions. I think we forget that because our modern day concept of war and it is now being shaken by Ukraine for sure. But our modern day concepts of war, certainly in the 21st century, were, short, sharp, shock, there's a storm type things. Morale didn't really come into it if you were on the winning side. There was no attritional fatigue type morale. 100 hours, I think, Desert Storm lasted, something like that. It was not much longer than that. But the air campaign lasted a little bit longer than that. But not months and not years. Right. Whereas some of the bomber crews and fighter pilots in World War II, quite literally fought from 1939 till 1945. That's pretty close to 6 years. And so the morale and fatigue and attrition, all this sort of stuff, are completely different for each one of the three domains.
Well, and this is a good segue into one of the points that you had made, that morale and motivation are two different things. And a lot of times people get those confused. And it's especially in a world of short conflicts, a world of without the fatigue of long operations, that gets confused. And I think, at least in the modern era where people see those two brought separately, is in counterinsurgencies, where you see morale versus motivation. You can have highly motivated units, well-trained, high esprit de corps, but do not have high morale on month 5 of a 6-month counterinsurgency, or for even the Army guys that I worked, month 12 of a 13-month deployment. They could be the best unit. That doesn't necessarily mean they have the highest morale, because there's been so many cumulative factors that have worn down. And we'll talk about it in a bit. Like you said, we always think of morale as all this list of factors that are positives and negatives that stack up. And that's an important part to it. But also understanding that those aren't all just at the tactical level. There are operational inputs, there are strategic inputs that all add up to those bonuses and minuses that sit on your stack.
Yeah, and I mentioned that in the Georgetown brief, that motivation is an individual thing. You're motivated, or I'm motivated at mile X of a run. All right, I'm gonna get past this, or whatever it might be. I'm gonna get up that hill. I'm gonna paddle that boat to wherever it might be, whatever that is. That's an individual, almost a sporting like motivation to complete the task. Morale, if you look at the definition of it in most military formats, usually is more encompassing of a unit, a group of people. And the NATO definition actually is to continue the mission in the face of adversity, losses, and confusion and this sort of stuff. So morale,
right.
Morale's a broader concept. I think you have individuals that are motivated within a unit, for sure. You'll have individuals that are motivated in life. But the morale of a country, the morale of an air wing, the morale of a squadron or a flight, and again, as you said before, I think that it's very different between small unit morale, cohesion of a flight or a small group, right, and then moving up to like the operational level where you're saying this is set to a certain extent that there are more variables but different variables that affect each of the three domains. So for the Army, for example, at the operational level, longevity, experience, training, these sorts of things are pretty perennial. You see that going on, and good equipment, right, and good plans, and success or failure on the battlefield can swing it. In the air at the operational level, I think we're talking more about things like, have we got the better weapons system? How well maintained are our ships? Do we trust the maintenance side of the house? Am I rotating? If I'm part of a squadron in a long-term conflict at the operational level, is my squadron being given rest and recuperation,
right,
and an ability to retrain and replace losses and so on and so forth? And at a strategic level, of course, morale is set to a certain extent by the example of the senior leaders in terms of making sure they're not being asked to do something that they know they can't.
Exactly.
And there are many examples of that. There's a lot in World War II where air groups and air units, for example, on aircraft carriers, were being asked to carry out missions that were virtually impossible, but they'd have a go anyway. Only right. once or twice. They'd say, no, we have to learn from experience. So I think there's a straight line correlation between morale and experience in the air. I think once an air force learns what it can and can't do, it's much more careful with its personnel. That's probably to do with unit count as well. An army has lots of individuals, right. As we're seeing in Ukraine right now. You can mobilize 300,000 people, give them basic infantry training, and off they go. They'll not be very good, but they can do it.
Right.
And let's not forget that Ukraine basically conscripted every male between the ages of 18 and 60 when the whole thing kicked off, apart from the ones that left the country with sort of refugees. So there's an experience there. Most of those guys had no more than 7 or 8 days worth of training.
Exactly. Well, and we've talked about it in very technical fields in the military. It's fascinating how morale can take on a I'm trying to think of the best word because we used it in our pre-discussion, but it is the reliability and your confidence in the equipment that you're given, because it doesn't matter how good of a pilot you are. If your airplane is not well maintained, you're going to fly it very well to the crash site. Or as we use the example, if you are the lead bomber crew and you have to cancel for maintenance and you have to turn around because one of your engines has failed or there's some other catastrophic problem. Now someone else is leading. What's the morale influence of those actions and of those impacts? And that in a technical field is in a way like having a platoon commander or company commander taken out by a sniper, but it's also different because there's very much I had no control. There's nothing I could have done. It was literally this one wrench turner or this one widget failed or, something conspired other than the enemy's action, to put a morale impact on me.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think you can you can draw Venn diagrams, as you and I chatted about before. You can draw Venn diagrams between, men, machines, and material, and if you like, sort of planning and processes. If you like, you want to put those all. If they're all circles and they intersect, if you've got really good, well-trained crews, then your morale will go up. Okay, even if they're not flying the best piece of kit, but marry that with good material, with a weapon system that is at least compatible with the enemies and it preferably better or some sort of advantage. And it might not be. It's an interesting one for air. The difference between, say, for example, ground units weapons and naval units weapons is usually pretty marginal. A rifle's a rifle's a rifle. I would prefer to have a 7.62 versus a 5.56 because I'll shoot you from 200 meters further. But that's just me being an infantryman. Tanks. Everybody goes, Tigers versus Shermans or whatever it might be. Well, tanks are tanks at the end of the day, and if you get close enough, you'll penetrate anything. If you're talking about this sort of stuff, but in the air, there are many facets. Better than I do in terms of, power to thrust ratio, wing loading. Am I maneuverable? Have I got, have I got a longer range and endurance to be able to stay in an area to complete my mission versus the enemy who can only be there for a little while and then have to go away? There's many examples from World War II where high morale units, very experienced, for example, German fighter pilots who'd fought in Spain and Poland and over France and were now fighting in, say, the Western Desert or over Malta or wherever it might be, massively experienced, and their planes had, up until about 1941, been pretty much the best on the block. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke 190s and stuff like this. But then, as soon as the Allies start to get reasonably trained people, but in better planes, then now we've got a slightly material advantage there. Okay, starting to creep in, and then of course you've got the whole of that logistics chain behind you. How many aircraft can you put holes in and still repair them and still get them up the next day? Sortie rates and this sort of thing. I'm
glad you brought up logistics, and I'm glad you brought up sortie rates, because the problem is in the discussion with our UK counterparts, it is the innate superiority of the Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain and basically the entire war. Has nothing to do with the nuts and bolts of keeping those airplanes flying or actually putting fuel, bullets, and all the logistics into them. So thank you for that.
well, because I'm not actually from the RAF, you see, I can read these accounts of the Battle of Britain and go, but really, hang on, we outnumbered the Luftwaffe most of the Battle of Britain. Don't mention that. Don't mention that.
Don't let the facts get in the way of history.
Oh, that's right. But all of these factors, I guess, really where I'm coming from here is that all of these factors, in much the same as in the land domain, much the same in the naval domain, but different factors affect the morale and motivation, the motivation of the individuals, but the morale of the units in an air environment. And I think you and I, we pulled together a little table, experience, weapon or aircraft superiority. At a tactical level, shock and surprise, and perhaps at an operational level, you can think Yom Kippur, 67, 6-day war type things.
Right.
And you can also, correlate it a little bit with naval warfare. Naval morale at an operational level tends to have been shaken, if not broken, by the loss of, say, for example, a particular flagship, or a particularly heavy defeat in one battle. I'm going to quote the Falklands again, but the sinking of the Belgrano basically put the Argentinian fleet into port. After that, they went, hang on, if we go out there, we'll probably lose something else. They probably wouldn't have done, but psychologically they went, we're not going to go and play that game again. Conversely, the Argentinian Air Force threw themselves day after day after day after day,
Yes.
At the very limit of their range, but had virtually no turnbacks and did not cease to press, an attack into the landing areas and later on, in various other locations on the islands. So they were at a disadvantage in terms of equipment. They were at a disadvantage in terms of missile systems. They're at a disadvantage in terms of intelligence. If you want to go, to that,
right.
Do I know where the enemy is? What's my SA? But they didn't stop coming. And there's a reason they won the World Cup. There's a little, Argentinians are by default.
They're by default hardy people, and people have forgotten that, I think, a lot.
Yeah,
how their culture is, and what a bootstrap kind of culture it is, and it's just rooted in a very border agrarian frontier kind of world.
It's the gaucho spirit. Yeah, it's the gaucho spirit. It is. Yeah.
Well, you really alluded to it here, and I want to dwell on it a moment, because games, if they simulate morale, tend to generalize what the route is. And we kind of laughed that's very different in each of the domains. And most people's image is from the land domain, that when you break that unit, it ceases to be combat effective, whether they just go to ground and surrender or they leave the board and rout. But obviously, we've discussed in a naval battle, you don't have a vote. You're going wherever the captain says you're going, and if he says you guys are going to the last torpedo, the last shell, and the last watertight door, that's what's going to happen. You may have very low morale as you're fighting that ship, but there's not a whole lot of a route there. So failing a morale check on a ship looks very different than for an infantry unit.
Correct. And I think failing a morale check for an air unit it is also different again.
Exactly.
So if rout is relatively speaking rare, if you look at history, complete disintegrations of units and armies and so on can happen, but generally speaking, it's a pretty rare occurrence. What tends to happen is people just sort of stop fighting, and the best. By the way, I'll quote a book here, a book by Leo Murray, which you may have read, called Brains and Bullets.
Right.
And it's very much a fact that when units start to not do things, they either flee. In other words, they just stop doing the mission and move away in some way, shape, or form. That can happen in any one of the three domains. Or they'll freeze. They'll continue doing the mission, but they won't be able to react, if you like, to what's happening around them. They're just sort of going through the motions. And then there's another one who uses 4F's, what's the other one? Or fight. If you're cornered, your morale's going, well, I'll still fight you. Because the alternative to that is just being, potentially being murdered, if you like, just shut down. And the other one is fussing. He calls it fussing, where basically people sort of try to do stuff, but it's not really combat. It's not really very combat effective, but nobody's going to know that I'm not actually doing my mission. Now, in the air, that's really quite tough since the days of radar and AWACS and GCI and so on and so forth, because and even I would perhaps go as far back as the invention of the gun camera. So when you now were able to look at gun footage, you'd be able to see whether or not a person, when they came back to base, I'm talking specifically about fighters here, but even the flash cameras on the Lancasters in World War II, bombers and B-17s as well, lots of film footage of whether or not they're hitting the target, whether or not they actually even made it to the target, which is actually quite interesting. So I think that a route in an air scenario is if you have the ability to disengage because you realize that you're disadvantaged, and or you really don't want to press it because your morale is down. That positive column of morale has been decreased by, I don't know, fatigue multiple missions, losses,
weather.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the turn back rating for a good raid in World War II in Europe was, between 5 to 6%. That was a really good. That was a fantastic. If you managed to get 95% of your aircraft to get over Germany, you were doing really well. And that was because of the maintenance and the wear and tear and so on. If you now look at the maintenance rates of modern aircraft and modern UAVs, I think it was in the congressional hearing on the F-35 a couple of years ago that it was regarded as good if you could get 50% of them up. 50 to 60% was good, and that's not because the maintenance teams aren't clever blokes. They are, but the machines are inherently more complex, and there's more systems.
Absolutely.
And it's a combination of systems and systems. But back to the route. I think in air you don't route. You find some reason to not go there.
Exactly. And we discussed that, and there's a fascinating difference with aviation and when you, in a sense, cross the line of departure and you're now, as we say, across the fence, across the blue line. There's a lot less options to turn back at that point. There's still a few until you find yourself either in that aerial engagement or over the target or in the enemy's the weapons engagement zone of their defenses. But I think that's an important point, that a lot of people, when that morale fails, it has to fail early, or the decision to make the choice to leave the fight has to happen early. Because once you're committed, you fall back into the I'm pinned in a corner. I have to fight my way out of this. We were talking about examples, and the F-16s over Baghdad, and you've got stroke flight where, as I was saying, from my perspective, the poor Dash 4 pilot who is being engaged by multiple Iraqi SAMs has seen one of his wingmen get shot down, is out of airspeed, out of ideas, and you can hear it in his voice. His morale is extremely low, but he knows that he has to leave. He has to get out of that target area. And so it's a very interesting piece. And I would be curious. I know some people that were in similar flights, but be curious what his morale was once he left the target area and was able to stop, decompress, put himself together, land the plane. That's the real test of what the morale effect was, not him and the individual action of leaving the target area. That was a survive or die kind of mentality there.
Yeah, and I think because air combat, people say it's quick, but it isn't really. Usually you've got a lot of ingress time, and usually you've got a fair bit of egress time as well to think about what just happened and to think about what's going to happen.
Right.
So I think that's that speed of decision in terms of I'm not going to do that because that's too risky or whatever. I think there's a chap called Lord Moran. I mentioned it in the Georgetown thing, who characterized courage as being like a bank account. In as much as you can keep on drawing from it to a certain extent, but then once you get into deficit, it starts to get really tricky. And I think if you look at air combat, that drawing on or putting something into the bank of courage is done at a unit level to begin with. But then rotating squadrons in and out, the amount of missions that were undertaken, say, for example, over Vietnam, because, there were some pilots and some bomber crews, third pilots and bomber crews in Vietnam who did mission after mission after mission after mission after mission, and then came back for a second tour and so on and so forth. But that was pretty rare. In general, people did a year and then they got out. All right, or got out. They were rotated back to the States or wherever it might be. So I think that morale in air operational levels is to do with unit rotation and replacements and training and these type of factors. In a tactical situation, that sets the scene. So if you're like, when the board game starts or when the game on the table starts, the morale condition of those pilots and the people who are actually flying the planes, in fact, I would say more so the leaders, flight leaders and squadron leaders and so on and so forth, has been shaped by what has happened in the campaign or in the timeline leading up to that.
Right.
Then you've got the actual war game or the game or the mission or whatever it might be, and that is much more shaped by circumstances, fast losses, situational awareness loss, jamming, all of these sorts of things. Anything that makes people not sure about what's happening tends to decrease morale, I think, very quickly in air games. And
well, I'll use the example. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, and I'll use the example of in Bandits 2, you have situational initiative. And so it is that combination of situational awareness, but morale effects and the unknown and all of those things that wear on your decision-making ability. Because, as you said in all the Fs, one of those is freeze or fidget or whatever. Yeah. Their term for find a useless task to do. And I've been that person myself when you are so overwhelmed that you cannot concentrate on anything but the most mundane task, and that's what you do, even though it may not contribute to the mission, but you can think about it. So I think there's something to be said at the tactical level for those things piling on and taking away your ability to properly react. They're not causing you to rout. They're not causing you to turn back, but it is weighing upon your own personal decision matrix so much that you're not thinking at the top of your game. You're not perceiving the enemy or the battlefield the way you should.
And there are many historical examples, and I've got quite literally a library full of books about air combat and air campaigns and so on and so forth, which I used as research for Bandits too. But one of the things that came out was strong and hard for me were the fact that losses. Sudden, immediate losses can break, and I think I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of Lee Brimmigan Wood's war games. Burning Blue
Absolutely.
And Downtown, and
if I could find any of them other than Red Storm, I would have bought them all, but they're only on eBay for multiple hundreds of dollars, so I don't like his games that much.
Yeah. Well, I bought them all as he was doing them because I was fascinated. But he has this type of situation built into most of those games where flights will become just combat ineffective. They might have only lost one plane, but if that plane happened to be the flight leader, you can guess that the rest of the guys who are probably not as experienced, certainly in these historical ones, are not going to be able to react as well. And it's very interesting. I was talking to some of our RCAF guys up here, the Canadian Air Force. We're doing a war game for them about manned-unmanned teaming. And one of the things that came out was the fact that in live, virtual, and constructive war games, professional war games, the effect of the loss of somebody in a simulator as part of your team has not the same effect as the fact that you've just seen somebody have their plane quite literally disintegrated, half a mile to your right or left or whatever it is.
Oh yeah. And that was one of the things we learned a lot was when there's no fear of death in some of these events and there's no repercussion, people will either push too far or they won't react the same way they would in combat. And we saw it all the time with our forward air controllers that simulators were great for them. It was a great way to improve upon their training. But until they were out there on top of the hill in the desert with a radio and an airplane dropping a 2,000-pound bomb that could end up on them if they did it wrong, then all of a sudden everybody was a lot tighter with how they did business. And so it's that combination of different methodologies and understanding that how people will behave in some of these situations, you can't simulate until you're there. You can get pretty close. It was always one of my biggest arguments with at the time when General Mattis was head of Joint Forces Command. And he said, we can just simulate everything. It's like a Hollywood movie. I'm like, no, sir, it's not, because I'm not scared in a Hollywood movie. I might jump when the guy comes out from behind the screen with the chainsaw, but I'm not scared for my life. On that hill dropping 2,000-pound bombs, I might be scared for my life, depending who's dropping them.
And interestingly enough, when you look at some of the great sort of aerial disasters, of history, whether it's Frankfurt, the ball bearings raids or whatever it might be. The only way in which air forces learn to change doctrine and change tactics is unfortunately usually by real losses. Training
Absolutely.
and exercises before a war don't necessarily, they may give you some doctrinal steers, if we've got stealth, maybe we want to shoot BVR all the time, blah, blah, blah. It'll give you some generalities. But until the losses start mounting up and missions start to not be performed because of either losses or morale breaks or whatever it is, and we're seeing that in Russia right now. The Russian Air Force basically wiped out the Ukrainian Air Force in the first sort of 48 hours, basically. Although we don't want to mention that, but basically
no one ever mentions that.
No, don't mention that. It's okay. But then they realized that if they flew over mainland Ukraine because their SEAD, missions, suppression of enemy air defense missions weren't being effective because the Ukrainians were being pretty clever at hiding their SAM systems by not revealing them. They eventually went, oh, hang on, this is crazy. Why do I actually need to fly over enemy territory here? Because all I'm doing is losing people.
Exactly.
And that's not a break in morale. That's a sensible tactical decision to not do what's killing lots of your guys.
Well, I laugh because we made the same mistake in Vietnam. Why did we transition from a MiG cap to a bar cap? We realized you don't have to cap over the airfield. And in fact, if you cap over the airfield, there's probably SAMs and AAA that are going to wait for you the next time you do it. So you're going to set off somewhere further away, draw the bandits somewhere else, draw them away from the strike package or push them away from the strike package, but don't cap over the top of the threat. That's how you get killed.
Yes, and I think you probably saw the slide that I put up in Georgetown. I think it was something like 70% of all U.S. Air Force losses in Vietnam were to AAA.
Oh yeah, that's been strategically misinterpreted in games forever.
SAMs didn't actually kill a lot, but morale-wise and tactics-wise, they were impact.
Well, and that's a very important piece to distinguish. And I pick on Dan Verson from DVG Games because as Phil and I have worked on Fulcrum Leader and Eagle Leader, there's things we've had to kind of decompose and wonder why he did a certain way. But because of the takeaway from the air war in North Vietnam, that AAA downed so many airplanes, it is too deadly in most of the Jet Leader series games. While they forget that the SAMs did have a huge morale impact because they were an area denial weapon in that sense. They carried this 14-mile bubble with them that went everywhere and you just didn't go into it. But the problem is you misapply that into a game and all of a sudden you have a KS-19 howitzer that is automatically causing you stress and killing you 50% of the time, which isn't really what happened. It didn't kill 50% of the flights that flew over. But if you flew unsuppressed, without maneuver, without jamming, into a radar-guided heavy AAA, your days were numbered, And so it's those fascinating nuances.
And what we talked about before in terms of the what you mentioned before about route. Let's not forget, at an operational level, an Air Force can often disengage its squadrons from an enemy in order to be able to either help them recuperate and regenerate and repair the aircraft if they've been damaged and so on and so forth. But I mean but sometimes it's just a case of, all right, we're not winning this one. We really aren't. We aren't winning it the way we're doing it. We need to scarp it, and we saw that. We saw it in Vietnam, where North Vietnamese jets flew quite literally into China, and could not be pursued into there. We saw it in Gulf War I, where about half of the Iraqi Air Force said, this is silly. Let's we
decided to become the Iranian Air Force.
We'll go to Iran. We were just fighting them 5 minutes ago, but it's okay. It's still better that we put them there.
It's not here. Yeah,
it's not here. And Kosovo, you mentioned Kosovo. MiGs that just went and hid They were putting the railway tunnels and all sorts of stuff out of the way.
There's a great 2 books that just came out from Hellion Press that I have that they literally talk about the ban on flying that happened after, I believe it was the 4th MiG-29 shoot down. Mm-hmm. And they just, the Yugoslav Air Force or the Serbian Air Force just said, it's not worth it. It is not worth flying those assets now. We will not achieve anything. And then one of their squadron commanders, I think about 20 days later, said, you know what, I'm going to go for one more mission. And he got shot down, and then they banned all flying together. They're like, there's no point. There is no reason to get airborne because they will find you and they will kill you. It's more important to use those assets at another time. So,
yeah. And we're back to that air superiority, air supremacy, air dominance sort of situation. That's historically very rare. There's only been a couple of instances of it, and as you say, and I thought it was interesting when you said there about SAMs moving around in terms of the morale effect. With S-400s and S-300s, that's hundreds of kilometers of bubble now. Unless you happen to be stealthy. So the possibility of getting dinged by an advanced air defense system, especially the density that you see around sort of China, Taiwan, anywhere in those sort of areas now, it's pretty high in actual fact. I think that
I use the example from one of our pilots in Kosovo who talked about the morale impact of unlocated SAMs. Yes. And so there were obviously a lot of SAMs that were not out there, not known where they were. You didn't realize you were in a threat weapons engagement zone until the missile came off the ground, and hopefully your radar warning gear also told you that. As he told us, he said the worst day of his life was when he looked down and saw the Serbian SA-3 come off the launcher and start climbing up at him. He said the best day of his life was when the missile turned and tracked his lead.
His lead.
Exactly. So his lead, and I've even told the story that as much as I make fun of the F-16 CJ seed guys, we loved them. We wouldn't have gone in country without them. But my happiest day was after all of us had been shot at, and we were really running out of country. We dropped our bombs. We were trying to get out of there as fast as possible. And I heard him behind us saying, Razor 5-1 defending, Singer 2. I'm like, thank God you guys are finally getting shot at because we've been taking all the shots today. So it's one of those moments where you feel bad for the other guy, but you're like, at least it's not me that's the guy in the hot seat now.
And we're back to that sort of that sort of perennial point, which is a morale shaker, if not a breaker, then a morale shaker, which is lack of SA. If you've got good GCI or you've got good AWACS cover, from miles away, as far as AWACS are concerned, the further they are away and able to do their job, the better, because they're big vulnerable targets. But to lose that either instantly or generally speaking not really have confidence in it, I think is a factor in morale. I built it into Bandits. I mean, I just reread Martin Middlebrook's book about Hamburg, the raid on Hamburg, and it was the very first time that window was used. So they'd had window for a while. They tried it over the UK. They went, okay, this works. It'll jam the radars. But they really didn't want to use it because it was going to blow the secret, if you like, as soon as they used it, because it's all over Germany. So they kept it until they had a really big raid, over Hamburg and a really big target. But if you read the accounts from the German fighter controllers, who, generally speaking, had a pretty good air picture. They knew what was going on, where the raids were going, and so on and so forth. That first couple of days when they used window, they were saying to the fighters, land. We don't know what's going on. We have no idea where the bomber stream is. We have no idea if you're going to be, getting caught by intruders, whatever it might be. We just don't know what's going on. And their default not the default setting, their reaction to that was, right, guys, just get on the ground until we figure this out, or go far away until we figure this out. Right. Go land over there for a bit, refuel, and then we'll see if we can figure it out. And that lasted for about 4 or 5 days. But the shock factor. Now, Clausewitz, I hate quoting Clausewitz, people should laugh at, but he said that surprise is a transient factor.
Yes.
It doesn't last forever. It lasts for a very short period of time, and then people will figure stuff out. Other classic examples of that are the fighter air controllers on the carrier groups in the Pacific in World War II. To begin with, it was an absolute mess, complete mess. Nobody was able to control fighters. Nobody was able to direct fighters. But gradually, as time went on, they changed their system within the CIC, I guess, to a certain extent, anyway, with the air control bit. And then as soon as they did that, the morale of the fighter squadrons on the carriers went up and up and up and up and up, because it went, okay, I'm now being vectored onto something. This is not going to be a suicide mission. They're not vectoring me, below a whole bunch of zeros. They're telling me what height to be at, which direction to be at, and so on and so forth. So that has a huge morale effect. Battle of Britain, I think I told you the story about, I'm from the northeast of England, and the Germans actually tried to attack from Norway only once. And the Hurricane Squadron that was scrambled to meet them over the North Sea found that they were actually outnumbered about 2-1 by the German escorts. And the flight commander famously had a stutter. And his wing, his second flight commander, said to him, can you see them? And he said, yes, I can see them. He said, well, what are we going to do? And he said, I don't know. I'm trying to fucking figure it out. But
exactly.
This wasn't morale. This wasn't his morale going. It was the fact that it was like, oh, hang on, I've now seen them, and that his radar coverage out that far was minimal. He was getting no direction at all.
Right.
It was a pretty much a miracle in the weather as to whether or not he could actually even see the target. So when he saw them, it was the shock of the appearance of them actually being in the right place, and he was in the right place at the right time. So you have a very pleasant morale shock.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen firsthand, we talked, when we did the pre-discussion for this, we talked a lot about the influence in the aggressor and adversary communities of morale and how that works into everything. And I saw it firsthand many times as an instructor when we would use our U.S. tactical advantage and take away the GCI or the AIC of the bandits. And based on their tactics, they were so adherent to that it was a morale detractor to them hugely. And there were numerous times that the bandits would come into land and I'd be there as one of the instructors, and they would look at me and go, why do we even go flying? We orbited around, couldn't hear anything, and you just turned in and shot us visually. They're like, were we a couple $1 million training aids? I go, yes. We were validating that you had 0 SA, your morale was at the lowest point, and you let yourself get bounced. So, but it's one of those, it's a cumulative morale and fatigue thing. You can only stay at a heightened sense of alert for so long. And even on a combat air patrol, when it's an exercise and the enemy is out there and they're going to bounce you, and in this sense, the students, wave of attack aircraft is coming, it's just hard to stay sharp the whole time and stay at the top of your game, even as an aggressor pilot. And they get worn down over time and get bounced.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Doug. The ability of combat experienced aircrew to pass on knowledge and key facets. We talked about doctrine, through the ages in the air, and how it has a huge effect on both the survivability and therefore the experience and morale of aircrew. So in World War I, Oswald Bolger, basically figured out fighter tactics, for the era. But his main contribution wasn't the fact that he figured it out and was shooting down, British planes left, right, and centre, but that he passed it on to the other members of his squadron, and including Richthofen, for example, and there's one example. But it was the being able to pass on, never attack into the, always look out for the Hun in the sun. There's these little phrases that were passed around the squadrons. There wasn't any there was no after action reports. There were no lessons learned teams. these were guys who were, I mean, in World War One, they were pretty much figuring it out as they went along anyway. Every facet of aerial warfare. But by the time you got to World War Two, people had realized, I think, that having an experienced squadron leader or a flight leader who was able to train the rest of the members of that flight, or an experienced bomber pilot. Very right. Often, one of the things that people don't realize that in World War II, bomber crews self-selected. They used to put everybody who just passed the course into a honking great big hangar and say, sort yourselves out into crews. That's how it was done.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, they said, okay, everybody in there come out in crews of 8 or whatever it is for the Lancasters. And they self-selected. So they went to see people that they knew, but very often the captain of the aircraft was not necessarily the ranking guy. He was the pilot who had the most experience. Often it would be a sergeant commanding, officers and the rest of the crew, for example, in a bomber. So morale in that instance was being raised by having somebody who knew what they were doing and being able to pass that around within the unit.
Well, and I think we talked about an interesting corollary to that is the morale impact of a loss of confidence, and not even just a loss of confidence inside a crew or a loss of confidence with the command, the squadron CO, but a loss of confidence with either allied or attached units. And, we talked about bomber crews who would recognize the tail colors, the nose colors, the wing markings of certain fighter squadrons, and that would be a morale boost because they knew those units stayed with and escorted you in and stuck with you the whole way and would escort you out if you were in a wounded bird. But then there's also the problem that there were sometimes squadrons that were unreliable, and that was a negative morale hit when you'd look out and you go, oh, it's that squadron again. I remember they left us last time before we got to the initial point,
Yeah, and or didn't turn up, and
right, yeah, well, exactly.
Didn't make the rendezvous. Everybody's on radio silence. I'm going to meet you at point X at time Y. You get there and they're not there, and I think the negative effect of that was mitigated to a certain extent. I think the command structure, certainly in the UK, realized that if you co-located or geographically co-located fighter squadrons and bomber squadrons, especially the B-17s flying out of East Anglia, the fighter squadrons that would be with them would come and visit. And they would get to know each other, if not socially, then, sort of outside of just the missions they were flying. So that you knew that, that squadron there from the 91st, well, they were the guys that we drank beer with in the pub down the road in Basingbourne. I know exactly where they were. So once that affinity was formed, and I think also that you get that as a problem as well when you see the Italians and the Germans trying to cooperate, for example, over the Mediterranean.
Right.
Not so much in the Pacific, because generally speaking, the British were fighting in one bit of the Pacific, the Americans were fighting in another bit of the Pacific, and the Japanese were fighting. They didn't have any real allies, if you like, other than themselves. But yeah, I think coalitions and multinational operations can be either really good or really bad for morale, depending on previous experience and the amount of training that you've had.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating as you talk about units that may not have trained together but build habitual relationships. We were very, very fortunate to have a very aggressive Air Expeditionary Wing CO for the Air Force units that were at Al Jaber with us at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And even though we had not trained with them, we had not worked with them, the fact that we were co-located and could just go over, we would see them in the gym, we'd see them in the chow hall. We knew who they were. And as you built a relationship, when those units would check in, by default, you treated them differently because you had a little bit of a relationship with those crews. Sometimes you'd recognize a mission call sign that you knew who was flying that day. And I know, especially for us as Marine forward air controllers, The Michigan, I believe it was Michigan, Air Guard A-10 squadron that was there with us. They were great, and we really didn't like working with a lot of the other A-10 squadrons, but we liked those guys because we were all in the same base. We'd get together, we'd talk about, debrief the mission afterwards, and there were no egos involved. So we felt like we could go out and execute the mission, and it was good to have that as a joint kind of Air Force and Marine Corps world, because it was funny in a sense. Some of those Air Force squadrons we became closer to than Marine squadrons that were not co-located with us. So if a Marine squadron would show up from the carrier, or one of the Harrier squadrons would show up from the Gulf, we didn't necessarily treat them, unless we knew who they were, we didn't necessarily treat them the same way as even some of the Air Force squadrons that we flew with, because we built that close and tight relationship.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because with a professional, not conscript, not wartime unit mix, your ability to be able to get, say, for example, the AWACS to work with the Special Military Defense unit, who then works with whatever strike unit it is, and for them to actually work together consistently to the point where they trust each other, and it almost becomes instinctive, but that can be done much more readily in a smaller peacetime environment to a certain extent. That training can take place, whereas I think in if you look back at the large wars, units were quite literally cobbled together and thrown together, and I don't think we should ever underestimate the hours and hours and hours of training time that were done by, say, for example, the Empire flying schools, here in Canada, who were training air crews up, and down in the States were training air crews up to go across to Europe way before the US got involved. 3 years basically. Air crews were being trained by that organization, and what is it? I think it's if you survive the first 5 missions or something, your chance of survival went up in World War II by like 80% or something. So every hour that they could do. Interestingly enough, the Germans never compromised on that. Even when they were getting bombed, nightly and daily, and when their fighter production was disrupted, it never really went down, but it was disrupted a fair bit. They never compromised on the amount of hours that they used for training, and the only time that they had to compromise was when they didn't have the fuel. And that was really late in the war. It was like 1944. Up to that point, they never shortcut the training time, because they realized just how vital it was.
Oh, well, and we've talked about it, that there's several inputs like that are confidence-building morale inputs. That it's your training, it's the maintenance that goes into it, knowing your maintainers, knowing the command, so knowing the missions you've been handed, that you're going to be given, yes, a difficult mission, but no one is asking you to do a mission they wouldn't do. I won't bring it up here, but you and I talked offline about some of the morale suppression that can go on when commanders literally tell you that you shouldn't be flying this mission. Nothing in that country is worth your life. And you say, but General, you're still sending me in there twice today and 2 times and 3 times tomorrow. So it's fascinating, the levels of interaction is from the operational and the strategic level, and the decisions made there, that the impacts they have down on tactical unit morale. But what we haven't talked about is the impact to the conduct of the conflict, of morale impacts to commanders and staff and, in a sense, supporting agencies at the operational and strategic. Because when their morale starts to fail or starts to be degraded, that then has a second or third order consequence on those tactical units because of the level of support they're receiving or the information they're being passed.
I think you're right. I think some of it's information, and I think some of it's also confidence building as well. If you think about World War II air commanders, almost every one of them had been a very experienced combat flyer in World War I. Everybody laughs at Goering and says, that his sort of, uniforms and stuff like this. You got to remember that this guy was an actual First World War ace with something like 20 or 30 kills to his credit. So, his credibility with the air crew of the Luftwaffe was huge. So if he said to them, go and bomb these things over here, they went, okay, because you know what you're doing. And it was the same for Park, Trenchard, LeMay. Not so much. I'm not sure if he fought in World War One. I don't think he did, but he certainly did half a dozen missions. And American Air Force generals, in actual fact, it was judged as a badge of honor if they didn't fly in the lead plane on at least a couple of missions. Right. So it was you must really, you have to do this. So I think there's two things. One is, do you trust at a squadron level, at I'm going to say at a tactical level, do you trust that the leaders who are sending you in, know what they're doing and are coming from, and are coming from, if you like, your street? They have street cred. Okay, they would never have used that phrase, but they have street cred. Bomber Harris, who sent all of the, the Bomber Command night raids in, was absolutely adored by his guys, even though they knew that, a large percentage of them, 25%, I think, of Bomber Command were shot down, killed, or wounded. So, it's a huge loss rate. But they never questioned Harris's logic, his tactics. He never launched a raid in bad weather except for one, which was a mistake. Where they lost, a whole bunch of people to icing and stuff like this. So if the weather wasn't good, they didn't go. If the moon was too high, they didn't go. He kept back units from the fight because they hadn't been trained correctly on, a new piece of kit, a targeting system or something like this. So knowing that the leadership cares for your survival permeates down through the organization. And I think I mentioned a really weird little side note. Balbo, who was the commander of the Italian Air Force in World War II to begin with, and who was a huge, a man way ahead of his time. He organized training for bombing in large numbers. He was an expert in anti-aircraft artillery. Was instrumental in getting really good Italian aircraft into the Italian Air Force, fast, maneuverable, all this sort of stuff. A guy who shaped the force, and in the first week that Italy went to war, maybe the second week that Italy went to war, was flying to Benghazi to go and take command of the Italian Air Force, who were about to attack with the Italian army into towards Cairo, in Egypt. Right. He was shot down by his own anti-aircraft gunners over Benghazi Harbor and killed quite tragically. And if you want a real interesting what if, all right, don't shoot him down and put him into a Western Desert campaign and have a really smart Italian air general commanding the Italians in the Western Desert. Whoa, It's completely different.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of impacts and there's a lot of decisions made off of higher commanders' morale and then the follow-on effects of that. And as we talked about, especially in coalitions, that there's times that the commander sees an inability of forces to fight together, an inability of them to even communicate about the most basic things. And that then, in a sense, wears on the morale of the commander because he is less likely to be bold, less likely to put those units together in an operation where they might have to rely on each other and they might have to very rapidly come up with a counterattack or a counter plan that they probably won't, because from what has been demonstrated in previous actions, those two units don't play well together. And that's, I think it's something, especially in air, where there is so much of aviation being a pickup game. Who are the crews that are going to show up to be your tankers? Who are the crews that are giving you AIC, GCI? Who are the other fighters that are escorting you? That when there's a bad mix in there somehow, that weighs heavily on the ability of the commander to perform those missions as a large picture.
And we've talked about it before in terms of how do you represent it in hobby wargaming.
Right.
And I think you can represent that type of morale break or morale waiver, if you like, before as a precursor to the scenario. So you can decrease the number of aircraft that are actually present because they didn't make a rendezvous or because they decided that it was like not a good day to do it or whatever it might be. So you can have that sort of coalition thing. The other thought that I had, just as you mentioned it there, Doug, was that there are some instances, some historical instances of air forces being really duffed up, being really, smacked around. And I'm thinking specifically of the British and the Americans in the in the Pacific theater in World War II. Where they took really bad losses. The Japanese planes were arguably superior until people figured out how to combat their particular advantages and so on and so forth with thatch weaves and all these sort of tactics and things. But there are instances where air forces have been quite badly smashed up, but then have recovered enough to be able to give themselves a bit of breathing room. So I think a good war game, if you're talking about it from a hobby perspective to a certain extent, a good tabletop war game should, if preferably, have some sort of linkage between those pilots and that unit and the next mission. So almost like that little mini campaign sort of scenario, a bit like Hornet Leader and these sort of things that were done, and so you can track fatigue, you can track experience, and that is a much richer depiction of real air war.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's the problem for most of us that are squad leader babies or Panzer leader. That was our first game. There really aren't that many campaigns in that kind of a game. You don't see the morale effects accumulate yet in a game like Hornet Leader, Phantom Leader. You see that with the cumulative stress over time. And even though it's very extrapolated and very generalized, it does represent that cumulative fatigue in a morale effect on a unit doesn't necessarily have to take everybody out, but when it takes the key player out, takes your flight leader out or the lead of a key asset or enabler, your EA6s, your RB66, whatever asset that you need, when that person is the one who is low morale, fatigued, has millions of things weighing on them that can be affecting their morale. Maybe their maintenance is not that good, and so they're not really looking to push the mission and go that far in country. There's a lot of different factors that I think games ignore at their peril, but know they must generalize. And I think that's always the difficulty. And that was one of the things I wanted to get to here tonight, is I wanted to say there's some things we know games ought to simulate and ought to model and ought to force you to think about. But at the same time, we're not saying that you have to take every one of those effects into account. And for all the people listening to the podcast, I'm sorry, when you go view it on YouTube, you will see some of these things that we listed out there and some of the effects we've talked about. But the reality is the games are generalized to make them either more accessible, so you can actually finish it in a reasonable amount of time, or more enjoyable, so it's not a lot of bookkeeping. But I think that you and I would agree that there should be, for it to really simulate the entire air domain, there must be some sort of morale effect. And likewise, kind of that output of the whole morale system, there must be a negative impact. There can be some positive impacts if you're feeling good, but there needs to be aircraft that don't go on the mission, air crews that don't fly, people that just aren't at the top of their game. As we talked about a few days ago, the fact that you can see negative morale cause people to either second guess their actions in combat in a moment of decision where they should guide the weapon to the target, or they should engage a specific target, or do something at the behest of one of their controllers. That indecision, because they're just not confident that everyone is behind them, that that all the information is right, or that the situational awareness picture is there. I think games should model that, but let's keep it fun. Let's not make it Third Reich.
Yeah, and I think yes, and I think that is the point, and I think that's, you know, as a war games designer professionally, but also as a player on a for fun bit. I think the minimum that you should have in an air game is different levels of experience. Right. I think that the minimum that would make it, and it doesn't have to be complex, ace, experienced, novice, great, that'll do.
Right.
All right, let's give them some advantages where it might be. But I think the other thing to think about, and I'm not so sure that it is as common, we discussed this the other day, as perhaps it should be, is that if the player is representing a single individual pilot, it might be a really quite good thing to say, well, you know, what level of morale is that pilot at today? And you give, you know, especially if you're playing a team based game where everybody's a pilot, you know, you've got 5 or 6 guys playing together or ladies playing together or whatever, and they say, okay, and not each person knowing what their morale start point is, either drawn randomly, which could be quite fun, or get them to decide it if you want, you know. But there's a fascinating, I think we talked about, there's a fascinating methodology that was used in a game which is based on S.L.A. Marshall's writings, designed by Paddy Griffiths, who I mentioned earlier, where each individual was either a fighter or a non-fighter. And interestingly enough, you know, pilots and aircrew were and are often chosen for their slightly aggressive nature because it's a risky thing to do, you know. So there's a character trait there that you're trying to select on to begin with. But to have that situation where you're not sure if the guy on your wing is really all in and is really going to protect your ass, exactly. Or whether or not that flight that's over there that was supposed to come screaming in from sort of, you know, east is not really screaming in from the east. It's sort of dawdling around. And you go, come on, and so I think you could have a lot of fun. It's almost a role playing aspect to the game because
there is,
you know,
and I think you talked about it. So for people who have not played, I believe it's Men Against Fire.
Men Against Fire,
is the system that those cards that you draw they're kind of specific in some ways. They'll tell you, okay, you can fight, but you can't cause damage to the enemy. You can't get killed and you can't cause damage to the enemy. So there's interesting combinations in there that do make it a bit of a role-playing game, as you have to think, okay, what does this mean? Does this mean I launch my missile and then I turn off my radar? You know, what do I do to guarantee that I achieve my personal morale or moral code victory conditions that then tell what I'm going to be able to do, and it's going to have a positive effect, vice weighing on the individual. But I think that would be interesting. It'd be a fascinating. I've told people. I told Kevin at DVG the other day when we were having dinner. I said someone needs to make a fighter role playing game. I realize it would be a bunch of arrogant people in the same room, but it might be fun role playing, you know, for that reason. Because, you know, as you say, we do try to select in fighter aviation specifically very aggressive, very, you know, action-oriented people, self-confident, action-oriented people. Those are the kind of people you generally surround yourself with in aviation. But there, in even Marine Corps fighter squadrons, Air Force fighter squadrons, there are people that are not as aggressive as others. And it's funny because when you get in that ready room, you tend to think of, that guy, he's kind of passive. Well, he's twice as aggressive as the average U.S. citizen. He's just not as aggressive as, you know, your CO, your flight leader. Yeah, this guy over here. Yeah. So it's interesting, but there certainly is, and I've seen it firsthand. I know we talked about it. I won't relate all the sea stories here, but I've seen firsthand aviators that are good aviators, competent aviators, good officers, but I've seen them when they pull their punches in combat or when they just don't act because they're really not all in on killing the enemy. They're there to support the Marines and they're there to do whatever, but I don't know if I really want to engage that target. They what if it in their own mind. And that's still a morale thing because once again, if they were out there, they saw Marines being taken under direct fire by the enemy, they would engage. Yes. But when it's slightly questionable, when the enemy, have they surrendered? Have they abandoned their vehicles? Are the vehicles, are they next to a town instead of in a field? All those moral decisions that in a sense have morale impacts, because now that person has to live with the consequences of their actions.
And let's also not forget that the reality of the accuracy and BDA, bomb damage assessment, or damage assessment from the air has historically been awful.
Terrible.
It's been awful.
I had this argument with some of the pilots that I work with, and I was raised to use the term bomb hit assessment, because that's about as good as I can give you from the air. I can say, did it hit where I intended? Did I see it detonate? As to the damage, as to how many bad guys I got, or did I even really destroy the vehicle? Who knows? That's someone go up there and exploit it and poke holes in the side of the tank to see if I actually got through it.
Well, I think I told you that I've got I'm a closet-carrying operations analyst, but I've got a fantastic OR book here, which was a compilation of a guy who went back into all of the operational research studies that were done after Normandy, and of course, the generally accepted myth is that rocket firing Typhoons and Thunderbolts and stuff like this massacred hundreds of German tanks and Hanemags and all this sort of stuff in near the Fallet Gap and all this stuff. And for sure, they got some. But in actual fact, when they went back probably about a month later and started counting up the various places where all these air attacks, hundreds of air attacks had taken place, actually, we didn't kill that many with from the air. I mean, there was quite a lot disabled, and lots of soft skins, but not very many armored vehicles, really. And the Germans would wait till the night time and they'd fix them and then they'd dry them off, So.
Yeah, it's like Kosovo. We talked about that even with my A-10 friends who had claimed a lot of armor kills, and then we saw all these very pristine-looking tanks and APCs leaving at the end of the pizza cord. Yeah. We're like, I thought we destroyed them all, because as you do the BDA and you count up, we've destroyed 2 times as many armored vehicles as the Serbs had when they started this conflict.
Yes.
Yeah. So BDA from altitude is notoriously bad. Bad.
And overclaiming as well, and not intentionally overclaiming. I mean, I think figures in World War II were about ×7. And I think we're seeing that in Ukraine as well, actually. If you count up how many Russian tanks have supposedly been killed, well, it's like, oh, really? Okay. I mean, it's getting easier.
I'm the first to tell the story that, I'm as bad about that as a forward air controller, because we would come back and we would report our BDA and report the BDA, the flights that worked with us, but then they'd go back and they'd report their BDA. And, the ops and intel guys, they were not cross-referencing that. So everybody's tanks and vehicles got all totaled up, and one day we destroyed the entire.
Everybody's getting high five. We've killed loads.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We're like, that was 2 missions. We took out maybe 6 tanks, I think. Now, why is it 18 tanks on the board? So yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. But having said that, I think there's probably psychologically something interesting going on there, in as much as I want to think that I shot this down.
Yes.
Because, and as I say, gun cameras, obviously started to try and bring a little bit more accuracy to it. But I want to feel that I have risked my life and I got something and I came back. And and again, it was one of these ones where experienced flight leaders and experienced squadron leaders were going, okay, then, so we think we've done this, but did you really see it going to the sea?
Yeah.
Well, no, he had smoke coming off him. Really? Did he have smoke coming off, or was that from his exhausts? So
to me, the best example of that is the Russian MiG pilots in the Korean War, and you read their accounts in Red Devils Over the Yalu, and it's a great book. I tell people, if you haven't read it and you want to do any Korean War gaming, you need to read it to understand why all of our assumptions, both from the Russian and communist side and from the UN side, are all absolutely wrong. Because even in there, so many of their pilots were reporting cannon engagements at 1,000 meters. And their squadron COs who were World War II aces were going,
No.
How can you hit the broadside of a barn with
No.
223s and a 37 at that range, you know?
Yeah.
And so it was the wishful thinking. And they were like, well, I saw smoke. Well, there was also a lot of anti-aircraft fire at that B-29. Are you sure that you got it, not the anti-aircraft, and vice versa? You know?
And there's a lovely account, in actual fact, of I can't remember who it was now. It was one of the German aces over Malta or somewhere like that, who got isolated and was being pounced on by three British fighters, and he fired his guns so that it looked as though he was actually on fire.
Oh.
And then he broke away into some cloud, and they all thought that they'd got him, and it wasn't. It was actually the exhaust from it, whatever. But I think morale in all three of the domains is not very well represented sometimes. I think that the air domain is particularly interesting because it has that long morale game, if you like, in terms of you know, months and weeks and all of the things to do with training and kit and logistics and support and leadership. But it also has that real sort of instant, am I going to put my neck out here moment, in a very time compressed situation where I think probably experience counts more than morale at that point. I think you're fighting or you're running. It's a bit more like naval at the tactical level. You know, I can either stay and fight, but this might not be a good idea, or I'm going to get out of dodge and I'm going to come back and get him later. And most of the aces, if you're talking about fighter combat, most of the aces, you know, were very, very, very astute as to when to engage and when not to engage. That's why they became aces.
That's why they lived long enough. They didn't just find every fight to go into. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a fascinating subject, and one which I think, it's underutilized. Let's just put it that way.
Absolutely. We have just scratched the surface of it. I would love to talk longer, but I also know that you have things to do. I have things to do. Our podcast listeners, their eyes are rolling back in their head from this cerebral of a discussion. They want to know rules, modifiers, die rolls. But this has been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss morale in aviation wargaming and its impacts and the things that we can model, the things we should talk about, and the levels, because I think the really important takeaway that we forget a lot of times is in aviation, so much is encompassed in the scenario. Yes. And that all of those external factors have to be worked into the scenario because you really can't deal with them at the tactical level, but they've shaped the battle up until the moment of engagement. And so they're critically important, but they're not something you're going to look on a table or roll a die. It's going to be built into the construct of how many aircraft do you have? What is the starting skill level of your pilots? What is their starting, you know, in Blood Red Skies, we talk about advantage level. You know, they might be flying great airplanes, but if they are at a low morale point, they may not be at the top of their game. So they might not have advantage. They might not be flying as well as they could. So I think there's a lot of ways it can be modeled, a lot of ways it can be interpreted, and I think that, at least for those of us that do mostly aerial wargaming, it's a fascinating challenge to see how we can incorporate that into a series of games.
And I think that last point there that you just made is perhaps my sort of last takeaway on it, and that is that if this scenario is going to represent something in a period of time, at a point in time where something has happened before and something will happen afterwards, then you are going to get, if you can have any sort of continuity in your wargaming, you know, play 3 missions or whatever it might be, even if they're short missions, you can extrapolate between them. So, you know, the first one, everybody are novices. They're very enthusiastic, very gung-ho. How many losses did you take? Okay, well, let's extrapolate for the second game, which may be faster or you know, whatever it might be, depending on the system that you're using. Let's play the second game, but let's assume now that, you know, they're not quite as gung-ho. They've seen some of their mates get shot down. They've lost a couple of experienced guys. Their situational awareness has decreased a little bit because then, you know, they're just concentrating on getting there and getting back. And then, if they're successful, they shoot down some enemy and they do a couple of successful missions, then you bump it up a little bit. You give them something else in terms of either their essay or their skill or whatever it might be. So I think multiple games, not iterative, because that's more on the professional side, but linked scenarios.
Yes.
Or even, as you say, some sort of random table to say what has occurred to this squadron before the game starts, and keep it secret from the other player.
Right.
All right. This looks like a really tough squadron, and the other player's going, man, I'm going to have a real hard problem with this. But in actual fact, by some previous means, you have a history where that squadron, in actual fact, is really not wanting to do this. It really does not want to be there. It wants to be at home. And
I promised our listeners we did not tell him about the Blood Red Skies campaign system. So I did not preload David with this information. Yeah. The thing that we've learned from playing a game like Blood Red Skies that is so much about combined effects on the morale and breaking squadrons and causing squadrons to disengage instead of last man standing, everyone being shot down, that is part of the fun of the game. Is there's a story between each one of these. Yeah. If the squadron only lost one airplane but still left the fight in the first game, that's going to be a different impact than if they lost half of their fighters before they broke and left. So there's a lot of different ways you can extrapolate a narrative to that. And as we've said, at the end of the day, it becomes a little bit of role playing. And I think as much as we as wargamers want this very hard line between very serious, war games and role playing games, there's some elements of the RPG that transition well and that influence and allow us to put ourselves in the narrative of those squadrons and in the situation that those aircrew are facing and their concerns and what is their morale going into that next scenario, knowing they still have to do their job or find a way to abort out of the mission. So.
And in 5 years' time, that might not be the case because you'll have unmanned unmanned assets with AI on and so on and so forth that can do some things and they're fearless.
Well, you assume they're fearless until we get the first AI goes, that's a really stupid mission. I don't want to do that.
Well, that was going to be my final point. In as much as up to this point, manned aircraft have a human factor, and morale and motivation is a key point. For an AI-driven platform, somebody has to program a survival instinct into these things.
Yes.
Because otherwise they'll just be like kamikazes and you'll lose them all.
Right.
I think that the latest RUSI report from Ukraine said that 9 out of 10 drones that are being employed are being knocked down, pretty much instantly by whatever means. So to have a very expensive unmanned system that can do what a manned system could do, they're going to have to be programmed with some sort of survival instinct. Otherwise, they're going to be just doing, doctrinally, they'll be stupid. They'll fly into envelopes, which are, you shouldn't go there. Really don't go there. So that,
although I think we've all validated that when they draw the big red circles and hash marks, you fly there a week later, you're like, where was all the stuff in this circle that was supposed to kill me? So
in place, isn't it? Did they just disappear?
You're like, who from Intel drew this circle? Because apparently there was nothing here to start with. So everything was over there, the area where they didn't draw a circle. So
yeah, good stuff.
Well, awesome. Thank you for sharing your time. I really appreciate it. Undoubtedly, we'll get together and have a discussion at some other point, and hopefully we'll link up at either Connections, one of the events. I know Mitch and his crew keeps trying to drag me to those, and since I'm not a professional DoD wargamer, I try to avoid those. But definitely it'd be a good time to compare notes and to talk about aviation morale more. So thank you for being on the program.
Actually play a wargame. That would be the thing to do, I think.
Crazy. Why would we do that?
Why would we do that? Doug, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Why would we enjoy our getting together?
Thanks very much for inviting me on. It's been quite interesting.